The year is 1937 in Los Angeles. An old man named Hannon Fuller is seen writing a letter for his closest apprentice, Douglas Hall. In the letter, Fuller talks about an unpleasant truth of the world. After finishing up, he leaves the letter with a trusted bartender named Ashton and tells him to hand it over to Douglas. However, right after Fuller departs, Ashton sneakily opens the letter and reads it. Midnight to 4:15, shocked by the contents, he then drives to a place he would never usually go to. After driving for hours, his car is the only car on the road. It's just him and the heat and the dust. There are warnings and barricades that ask him to stop, but he doesn't listen. When Ashton reaches a bit further, he realizes that something isn't right. There's no movement, no life, as if the world around him is crumbling slowly. And when he gets out of the car, what he sees shocks him to the core. 56:47, 58:00. It appears to be the end of the world. All he can see is endless lines of matrix. This is when Ashton realizes that the world around him is all fake and he himself is just an artificial creation. 1 hour and 10 minutes. Back to 4:15. Meanwhile, the old man from earlier, Fuller, returns home and lies down next to his wife. However, when he closes his eyes, he wakes up in the present-day Los Angeles in 1999. Now this is the real world. It is then revealed that the 1937 world is just a virtual reality simulation, and Fuller is the creator of it. This world gives people a perfect experience of the past. They can interact with computerized people, make friends, and even have fun with girls. And despite being a simulated world, the characters there are oblivious that they are not real. They are electronic people living a normal human life, just like Ashton. A person from the real world, however, can temporarily take control of a character in the VR world and do whatever they please with that control. In the next scene, Fuller, who has just woken up from the virtual world, cautiously leaves the building. He then goes to a bar and uses the payphone to call Douglas, but the call is not answered. Soon, a mysterious man appears and Fuller follows him outside. The two chat for a while, but shockingly the man stabs Fuller with a knife and murders him. The next morning, Douglas wakes up and finds blood-stained clothes in his laundry bucket. He is obviously confused where it came from, but before he could investigate, he gets a call from Detective McBain of LAPD and learns about his mentor, Fuller's murder. The two then meet at Fuller's apartment. Here, it is revealed that Douglas had a close relationship with Fuller and they are working on a highly classified project, which is the virtual reality world of 1937. The detective mentions that Douglas has become the prime suspect of the murder, as Fuller last tried to contact him before his death. Just then, the two encounter a distraught young woman named Jane in Fuller's bedroom. When Douglas questions her, she reveals that she is the only daughter of Mr. Fuller, and has only returned from Paris after learning of her dad's death. Douglas then leaves the two alone for interrogation, while he goes to the VR lab. There, he talks with his co-worker Jason Whitney, and the latter reveals that Fuller was secretly testing the 1937 LA simulation. Douglas is caught off guard as he was under the impression that the company was months away from the first trial run. Afterwards, Douglas returns home and goes through his audio messages. In one of them, an anxious Fuller tells him that he has found something incredible and that he has left a letter for him inside the 1937 VR simulation because he fears his own death is imminent. Douglas then heads straight back to the VR lab and tells his colleague, Jason, about the message. He asks him about the VR characters Fuller interacted with last night and also reveals his desire to go into the VR simulation. Jason is naturally against it. However, Douglas is adamant on finding answers, as now, even the police are starting to suspect him of being the murderer. Moreover, he himself is not sure if he's innocent because all evidence points to him and he can't even remember what happened that night. Jason finally agrees to let him go into the system, but only for 2 hours. Shortly after, the preparation for the simulation commences, and after a few adjustments, Douglas is sent back to 1937 LA. Jason assigns him the role of a wealthy bank clerk named John Ferguson. At first, Douglas, who now possesses Ferguson, seems confused and tries to process everything that just happened. But soon, he is taken aback by the accurate representation of the city, which makes him smile for a while. Then, he takes a break from Ferguson's work and goes to meet Fuller's 1937 double named Grierson, who is a historian. The two talk for a while, but surprisingly, Grierson asserts that he doesn't remember writing any letter to him. Here, it is revealed that once a person leaves the simulation, her double will immediately forget about the events that occurred while they were under control. But with that being said, Grierson admits that he has a clue probably because he remembers some fragments of his memories. This leads Douglas to the bartender, Jerry Ashton. Surprisingly, Ashton turns out to be the 1937 double of Jason, which takes Douglas by surprise. However, he ignores it and inquires if Fuller left a message for him. The bartender feigns ignorance and denies receiving any messages. It seems like he's bitter as he has now learned the truth about him being a simulation. Hearing this, Douglas is puzzled and he suddenly begins to hallucinate. He quickly rushes to the bathroom suffering from seizure before collapsing on the ground. Back in the 1997 VR lab, warning signs go off and Jason terminates the connection and brings Douglas back. Jason explains that the unit started glitching because Douglas spent 2 hours inside the simulation, which is double the recommended time. After collecting himself, Douglas shares his experience inside the simulation and happily tells Jason that the VR very much works. Meanwhile, in the 1937 simulation, Ashton the bartender speaks with John Ferguson once he emerges from the washroom. However, Ferguson is puzzled how he got to the hotel and doesn't recall having any conversation with Aston. Back in 1997, a waiter named Tom Jones from the bar outside which Fuller was killed shows up at the company HQ. He speaks with Douglas privately and mentions that he saw the crime taking place. When the latter asks about the killer, Jones reveals that it was none other than Douglas himself. He then demands a large ransom to keep his mouth shut about the murder. Douglas is naturally puzzled as he doesn't recall killing his own mentor. However, suddenly, something takes over him, as if he has become possessed. Douglas then attacks Jones with tremendous rage, prompting him to run away. At this point, he has become extremely confused and doesn't know whom to trust and whom not to. Later, Douglas takes Jane out for dinner and tells her everything. It's clear that the two have started to like each other and Jane advises him to walk away from all of this before he gets hurt like her father did. Douglas thanks her for her concern and soon, the two start dancing. One thing leads to another and the two start making out. Following the romantic dinner, Douglas returns home and later that night, several police officers storm into his place and take him to the station on suspicion of murder of Tom Jones. Detective McBain reveals that Jones came to the police station and gave a statement claiming he saw Fuller leaving with Douglas on the night he was murdered. However, Jones was brutally murdered last night. The damning evidence is enough to keep Douglas behind bars, but the very next morning, Jane arrives at the station and bails him out. She even vouches for Douglas that he was present with her during the time Jones was killed. Jane is sure that Douglas is innocent, but he feels that just because he doesn't remember anything, doesn't mean he's not the killer. Searching for answers, Douglas goes straight to the VR lab and teleports his consciousness into John Ferguson's body in 1937 LA. He then goes to meet Grierson, Fuller's VR double. It's late at night and the old man doesn't want to talk, but Douglas promises to reveal why he sometimes wakes up in unknown places if he comes with him. Shortly after, the two go to the Wilshire Grand Hotel and Grierson reveals that in the last 3 days, he's been having strange memory flashes or he finds himself at the hotel time and time again. Hearing this, Douglas becomes happy, and he pressures Grierson to recall if he gave someone a letter or a note. After much effort, the old man finally remembers giving a letter to Ashton the bartender. However, before Douglas can make his way to the counter, Ashton runs away. Douglas chases him to the basement and eventually confronts him. Unfortunately, Ashton pulls out a gun and demands to know what's going on. Douglas pretends to know nothing, but Ashton tells him that he noticed Douglas switching places with Ferguson. He also reveals that he read the letter left by Fuller. Ashton knows that he is an artificial creation, and the world around them is not real. To see for himself, following the instructions on the letter, Ashton drove to a place he would never go to. To his shock, after reaching a certain point, he found out that there was no life, it's simply a computer simulation. Douglas is puzzled as to why Fuller would write to him about the limitations of simulation because he already knows them. But before he can say anything, Ashton threatens to kill him for messing up people's minds and tries drowning him in a pool. Douglas fights for his life, and in the VR lab, his real self can also be seen convulsing. Luckily, Jason arrives in the nick of time and brings his friend back from the simulation. Douglas is shaken up by the incident and declares the project a mistake. He then announces his decision to shut the project down, much to the dismay of Jason. Following this, Douglas goes to meet Jane at her hotel but learns that she has already checked out. Detective McBain, who has also come to meet Jane, approaches Douglas and reveals something shocking. He claims that according to his research, Fuller doesn't have a daughter and that there's no woman named Jane Fuller in the US or France. After a while, Douglas bribes the hotel driver to obtain the last address where he dropped the woman claiming to be Jane Fuller. There, someone directs Douglas to a woman named Natasha Molinaro, a cashier at a supermarket. In a shocking turn of event, Natasha turns out to be the VA form of Jane Fuller, and she doesn't recognize Douglas or remember anything about the multi-billion-dollar Fuller enterprise. However, she admits that she feels a strange connection with Douglas. With this, Douglas finally unravels the shocking truth that his world, the 1997 Los Angeles, is also another simulation. This is further confirmed when he drives to a place where he never would have considered going otherwise, the end of the world. He discovers that beyond a point the world becomes a crude wireframe model. It turns out that the letter which Fuller had left for Douglas was to explain that this world is also not real. Meanwhile, Detective McBain reaches Natasha's supermarket and confronts her for lying about her identity. But as expected, she neither remembers him nor understands what he is saying. This makes McBain realize that something is really wrong with this world, so he leaves to investigate further. Panicking, Natasha's real-life user, Jane Fuller, downloads into her again and contacts Douglas. She asks to meet him, promising to reveal everything. Shortly after, when the two reunite, Jane gets straight to the point and explains that there are thousands of simulations, but this is the only one that managed to create a simulation within the simulation. The real world is actually in the year 2024, where she is the daughter of Fuller. She then reveals that it was indeed Douglas who killed the old man. However, she comforts him, saying that it's not his fault because he was being controlled by a user, her real-life husband, David. Jane reveals that her husband was a decent man when she first fell in love with him, but as time passed by, something happened to him. He began to use the simulation as his own personal playground, where he killed people for fun. Elsewhere, at the VR lab, Jason gets curious about the simulation, so he downloads into Ashton's body. Unfortunately, he ends up getting killed by a car inside the 1937 simulation. Because of this, Ashton's consciousness takes control of Jason's body in the 1997 simulation. The bartender is mesmerized by the new environment, and his strange behavior prompts security to alert Douglas, who is in bed with Jane. Douglas quickly gets dressed and rushes to the lab. Upon talking to Jason, he figures out that it's not his friend, but the imposter bartender. He tries to engage in a normal conversation, but Ashton holds him at gunpoint and demands answers from him. Left with no choice, Douglas reveals that they are not in the real world, and that they are both products of a VR simulation. Saying this, he takes Ashton to the place where he was born, the computer lab. Although confused at first, Ashton starts liking the place, and even keeps his gun down to breathe in the fresh air. Suddenly, Jane's husband, David, from the real world of 2024, takes control of Douglas and kills Ashton using his own gun. He then finds his wife at Douglas' apartment. Jealous, he attempts to murder her. However, before he can do anything, Detective McBain arrives at the scene and shoots him dead. It appears as if the detective has also realized that they are in a computer simulation. Before parting ways, he requests Jane to leave them alone once she goes back to the real world. The scene then cuts to the real world. It's the year 2024. David's death in 1997 simulation allows Douglas' artificial simulation to take over David's body in the real world. He's shocked to wake up in a huge mansion, where he finally reunites with Jane. She takes him to the balcony to show him the high-tech world of 2024. However, the surprise doesn't end there, as Fuller turns out to be alive and well in this real world. The film ends with the real world shrinking to a digital line of imagery, which may hint that this world is also another simulation.